start? Let's see. How's everyone's Derbycon going so far? Everyone having a good time? Good, yeah. All right, let's see. Why are we all here today? Our talk overview, a few things we'll be covering, information about both of our speakers, a couple background points that you might need to know through the presentation, and a couple frequently used techniques in post-exploitation. We're going to kind of be going over the past of post-exploitation and the future where we see it moving towards. We'll briefly talk about implementing a couple of these techniques in Cobalt Strikes and then conclude. Who am I? My name is Michael Roberts. I have a dog named Wile E. Coyote. I go to the University of Central Florida, and I mostly do Windows security.
Hi, my name is Martin Roberts. I also go to the University of Central Florida, and I focus on Linux security. We will be just for our introduction, talking about some competitions that we've done in the past. These are all offensive competitions, if you're aware. Panoply at CCDC, and Panoply at Black Hat we won this year, and ISTS and ESET and all some other offensive competitions. We love to do competitions, and that's why it's here. So we'd like to start off by giving special thanks to some other people that we did this research with. First is Jonathan Chua. He worked with us at X-Force Red this summer, where we interned doing pen testing. So we're going to start off giving some background knowledge. First, what is post-exploitation? Basically, we define it as everything that happens after getting a shell. So a couple questions that we have to ask. How do you move across the network? And how do you gather information on that network that you just landed on? We'd like to start off by just stating that credentials are really important. We believe that credentials are the most important thing you can gather during this red team operation. With credentials, you have basically persistence where you can log into remote services, SMB, SSH, across the network. So credentials are key, and we just want to point that out. That's a premise of our talk. So another necessary background item is what is opsec. So another just basic definition, it's preventing what you're doing from getting flagged by your enemy, or in this case the blue team. As you all know, red team's trying to not get caught by blue team. We'll be talking about it here. So why is post-exploitation important? Why are you here? Why should this matter? So you spend weeks trying to get a shell with Cobalt Strike, or you spend weeks trying to get a shell with your phishing. You might use Cobalt Strike or other products to set up your infrastructure, but you spend a lot of time. So when you get a shell, you're really happy. I'm sure you all know. You want to keep that hard-earned shell. And then second, if you do lose your shell, and it's because of a endpoint detection product getting flagging your actions, then the blue team is, one, aware of what you're doing, and two, watching you. So the next steps might be to prevent the way that you got in the first time, if that makes sense. So you get a shell the first time, the blue team's going to be working on preventing the way you got the shell, and then also watching your actions across the network, and just generally they're going to be more suspicious. So you do not want to get flagged by the red team, or by the blue team, when you're performing red team operations. And Michael's going to talk about frequently used techniques.
Code execution, which you might be most familiar with, of course, PowerShell, just code execution through command prompt, and a million different old ways of doing command execution that have been around forever, getting your executable through IEX or bitsadmin, or just copying it over SMB or something like that. Older methods that are very likely to get caught by endpoint detection response solutions and any mature blue team organization. Lateral movement, obviously past the hash in a suspicious way will get caught. A lot of times remote PowerShell and PSExec by a secure organization will get caught. And then later on, we're going to talk about how to improve upon these and new solutions in the industry, so you don't have to use WinRM and remote PowerShell for stuff. Persistence, writing a malicious exe to disk and including it in a startup folder or an obvious registry key or even a scheduled task is going to get flagged by an endpoint detection response. At least like CrowdStrike Falcon and Microsoft ATA will flag all of these, especially the last three. So these are kind of techniques that obviously can't be used anymore. A few critical flaws.
Okay, so basically a critical flaw is something that's just going to get flagged by endpoint detection some of the time, most of the time, or all of the time. So leaving suspicious logs behind is the first item we'll be talking about. Just basic things that leave, logs behind, login attempts. You want to watch your login time. If, the user is 9 to 5 Eastern or something, and you are logging in at, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., every day, that could be suspicious if the user hasn't previously logged in at those weird times. So just watch login time, something basic. Sudo attempts for the Linux, Unix systems. Sudo attempts will be logged, and then someone could be checking that out if they're watching logs, if it's a mature organization. And then creating users. Something that I hope most people don't do, but some people feel it's necessary to create a user. That's heavily logged. The company is going to be, asking, did we get a new employee recently? Why are we creating a new user? So you should be asking the question, is this necessary for your needs? Excessive disk writes. Do you need to be writing to disk, and can you be running it in memory? A classic example of this, just on Linux, would be curling something down, say Linux prevs script. So curl, the script, and then instead of writing it to disk with like the -o flag, you can just pipe it to bash. It will run in memory as a process, and it won't write to disk. So just things to remember. How can I be running things in memory instead of writing to disk whenever possible? And is the EDR scanning this location? This is something we'll cover here. We'll cover later. Unusual PowerShell commands. Do you need to run the command that you're running? We have an example here. This dig command will return a list of domain controllers in the environment. This dig command can be ran from like Linux, Unix host that you've acquired, instead of having to run a similar command in PowerShell. So if you can't avoid PowerShell just because of PowerShell version 5 logging, look for other ways to do it. Linux hosts, Unix hosts that are on that network. And detection by EDR. Obviously, you want to avoid getting detected by EDR. Some of the reasons we mentioned earlier were that the blue team's watching you. Your life's going to be a lot harder. You're not going to be able to gather the information that you need. So if you're, outside of normal user behavior, if you're just trying a bunch of creds against the domain controller, just doing really noisy stuff, you could just be flagged by the blue team. So if you're writing to disk, you could be flagged by like EDR if the common tools have signatures with that EDR product. So things to note, just basic things that you should keep in mind during an engagement. You want to follow normal user behavior. You want to use some of these services. SSH, NFS is some of my favorite, like RDP, SMB. Those services are widely used across the corporate network. And even better, they're going to use, most of the time, user credentials that are just similar across all of the hosts. So if you're able to acquire user credentials from, say, a Windows host, and you can use those to log into like critical infrastructure with SSH, or access critical files with SMB. So user credentials are key during post-exploitation. You want to gather those whenever possible. Private keys are obviously useful, assuming they have a weak or no passphrase on them. You can use private keys to log into like critical infrastructure. So those are just some important things to gather during an engagement. And then for like all the Mac users out there, I'm sure most of you have your user in the sudo group, which is necessary for just a lot of your roles every day. But being in the sudo group, the attacker can grab things like the keychain with your user password. So after they unlock your keychain, they have access to things like CrowdStrike Falcon if you're storing that in your keychain. yeah, just a bunch of things could be stored in your keychain. They can use those credentials to just log into other services that are critical. Yeah, you want to look for, if you're a red teamer, you want to look for just pseudo-privs on Mac OS or a similar system. And then the looking around the network, probably my favorite thing. Just an example this week, I was on an engagement and I was just looking around the network and I noticed that I was looking at all the SSH banners on that corporate network. The first time I saw it, looking at SSH banners, seeing what products are out there, seeing like the version numbers and stuff like that of SSH, and I noticed there was some like Raspberry Pis on the network. You guys might be questioning, why is Raspberry Pis on a mature corporate network? The answer is actually simpler than you'd think. Signage sometimes will be running off a Raspberry Pi, or in this case, a 3D printer was managed by a Raspberry Pi. So the key isn't to look for Raspberry Pis. The key is to look for hosts on the network that might not be in the classic realm of their endpoint detection. Devices like the Raspberry Pi or something similar that we'll talk about in the next slide. Those devices are almost certainly not monitored, by endpoint detection. So if you're able to launch all your attacks by, that host, you can evade a lot of detection, and you just want to live on those devices because they don't have, any logging probably. And we talked about earlier, credentials and keys are helpful to get into those boxes. Just something. Another example, looking around that network, I saw that like NFS was open. And I'm sure most of you are thinking, great, there's probably something great on that share. But it has another use. I saw NFS was open, and then I'm just looking at the nmap. There was, port 80 and port 443 open. I'm sure you can imagine where this is going. I check out the web portal, see what's there, and username, password was admin. So we have that storage controller, and that's great to see the files, but it actually has another use that we want to talk about. If you're on, just say, a compromised Linux host, and you want to avoid writing to disk on that host because you're afraid it could be monitored, or people could be looking at it, why not mount an NFS share and write to that? If you're write to it and then access it from that Linux host, it's very unlikely that they're monitoring new NFS shares. But the endpoint detection services that we've looked at, if they do monitor new NFS mounts, they don't block those actions. They just flag it, and then a user has to intervene, which we all know is slow, and they're not going to catch you right away. So you have at least a couple minutes, hours to do things on that host. Michael will be talking about improving techniques.
All right, let's start with code execution. Every day seems like on Twitter there's a new method of code execution that can get around Windows Defender or another endpoint solution. PowerPick's been around for a while. There's plenty of solutions for running completely in memory, avoiding writing to disk, which we talked about earlier, and overall just not getting caught by EDR solutions. Obviously, parent process spoofing, and we're seeing a trend of using more C# executables and stuff like that, like GhostPack and stuff written entirely in C# that you can compile yourself to have a different signature. So there's plenty of new techniques for still doing code execution and not using the old methods of PowerShell and stuff like that. Lateral movement. Let's see. Sharp WMI, I mentioned GhostPack earlier. Distributed COM objects is another new technique. There's tons of new techniques coming out every day that don't involve old lateral movement methods like WinRM and stuff that's going to get flagged immediately. Obviously, private keys on a Unix environment for lateral movement. persistence, fileless backdoor, so storing completely in registry or another part of the system, so it doesn't write to disk. Obviously, antivirus solutions immediately scan everything in disk, and any other endpoint detection will immediately catch something written to disk. So as fileless as you can go. Credentials, Martin briefly mentioned, credentials obviously being the best form of persistence. With valid credentials, you can avoid abnormal activity. So if you know a user's always going to log in to, say, manage a server, then you can use those credentials like that user would, and it's much less suspicious. There's other persistence methods, obviously, that won't get caught by EDR. TACMITR framework is a great place to reference these techniques. There's stuff like using third-party management software that an administrator might be using to manage that server. If you're using that to manage the server in your own way, that's less likely to get flagged. Implementing these techniques, we're just going to briefly talk about. We're just going to briefly talk about some of the ways that we did it. And more broadly, some of the ways that I guess we think you should also implement these techniques. So this is just a picture of a couple compiled Cobalt Strike aggressor scripts that we made into a menu. So MSHDAC script, stuff like that, that's coming out as new ways to execute code or binaries or whatever you want. There's plenty of new executables or methods written in C#, and we see the industry as moving more towards using C# and methods like this to download and execute codes. So a couple more methods, some lateral movement methods. And then persistence. Some of these are old ways, but we're just pointing out that it can be implemented in Cobalt Strike and
those ways can be implemented in Cobalt Strike, or any of the ideas that we mentioned today can be implemented in any platform that you use for your post-exploitation needs. So we don't want to get up here talk about all the ways maybe you can avoid EDR and all the ways to get your information that you need, whether it be credentials or just other information that you need from the corporate network, without talking about what can be done. So the standard thing you see is red team against blue team, and that's what this picture depicts. Some ways to defend against these techniques that either corporations aren't doing or aren't doing enough of. Lateral movement would be things like network segmentation. An example would be, why does all the Windows hosts need to talk to every other network in the environment? My example earlier with the Raspberry Pi, the signage, or the 3D printer running a Raspberry Pi, why do they need to communicate? You could have network segmentation there. Host-based firewalls, we're a huge fan of in our respective operating systems, so like IP tables on Linux. Why does that Linux host need to, or let's use the NAS example, why does that host that's just serving NFS need every single network open on 80? So why does every single network need to communicate with that NAS host on port 80 or 443? And why is 22 open on that NAS host if no one's using it? And if you do use it, restrict it by IP, because the admin privileges, or the credentials that I mentioned earlier, also worked with SSH. So I was able to SSH into that storage controller. So you're basically able to do anything you want to that storage controller. So yeah, host-based firewalls restrict IPs, or just block that port in general if possible. Passphrase on SSH keys is just something basic you could do. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. And then this is a big one. So active monitoring of EDR dashboards. Sure, you have a solution that either tells you when a critical event happens on that host, but someone needs to check it. Someone needs to be alerted when it happens. The NFS thing I mentioned earlier, mature EDRs might flag on new NFS host mount, but if someone's not checking that EDR solution, then nothing happens about it. Some defense techniques for persistence, things like threat hunting, looking, at what happened to a host or what's happening to a host and what's changed with the host. Limiting disk writes whenever possible. So you want to avoid a red teamer wants to avoid disk writes, but sometimes it's just not possible. You have to drop a binary on the disk for whatever reason. So limiting, if possible, as a blue team, limiting where they can write. Very simple. And then rotating passwords. So you should assume that passwords are compromised. The user that in my example earlier with the Raspberry Pi, they were logging into the Raspberry Pi, whether it be like VNC, and then they were SSHing outbound to other critical services, which is obviously bad. But the point is the user is going to make mistakes like that, so password rotation has to be a thing. So an old technique is just honeypots. You might be saying, why are you talking about that? Everyone's been talking about it for, who knows how many years. But if an attacker, like I was looking around the network at like NFS hosts, SSH hosts, looking at their banners, you want to catch an attacker doing those actions, and a great way to do it is to set up something like this, where you know that no one in the business with a legitimate purpose should be accessing this host. So you caught an attacker there. And you can, retrace his steps, what host he's coming from and things like that. And you just want to log what they're doing, because you're assuming that they're doing the same thing on other hosts. And, Michael, we're talking about defense techniques for code execution.
Code execution, we all know, like malicious PowerShell commands, common PowerShell commands, that shouldn't be run. And there's plenty of ways to block it. At the bottom I say logging. PowerShell version 5 has logging. Every major EDR solution, will, read, these PowerShell logs and, alert you if a malicious, command is, executed. I love sysmon. If you don't have a EDR solution, it's great for being able to see what commands are run and all the post-exploitation activities that are occurring. And of course, know your normal state, which was mentioned earlier in the presentation. Conclusion, implementation. There's plenty of ways to implement more secure opsec techniques during post-exploitation using C#, using PowerPick, using different techniques than the same old persistence, the same old techniques, building your own techniques like GhostPack I mentioned earlier. You have to build on your own in Visual Studio to avoid signature detection. Obviously, most organizations have signature detection, so you want to avoid that. This talk has many benefits to a red teamer if they can remain OPSEC safe during a presentation or during pen testing engagement. They can avoid detection by a blue team. They can last longer on the network. They can provide more results to the customers and stuff like that. So thanks for coming out. Any questions?